In the darkest corners of human history, few figures embody irony as completely as Tomás de Torquemada. Picture this: a man of Jewish ancestry who would dedicate his life to eradicating everything he represented, becoming the architect of one of history's most systematic campaigns of religious persecution. This is the story of how Spain's most feared Grand Inquisitor created a monster that would ultimately consume even its creator. The year is 1498, and in a modest cell in Avila, Spain, an elderly man lies dying. His breath comes in ragged gasps, and his weathered hands clutch a crucifix with desperate intensity. This is not the peaceful death of a holy man, but the agonized final moments of someone haunted by the ghosts of thousands he sent to their graves. Tomás de Torquemada, the man who transformed the Spanish Inquisition into an instrument of unprecedented terror, is about to face the ultimate judgment he spent his life avoiding. What makes Torquemada's story particularly chilling is not just the scale of his cruelty, but the profound contradiction at its heart. Here was a man whose own bloodline carried the very impurity he sought to eliminate from Spanish soil. His obsession with religious purity would drive him to create methods of detection so paranoid that even the innocent act of changing bedsheets on Saturday could sign a death warrant. The Spanish Inquisition, under Torquemada's guidance, would perfect the art of institutionalized suspicion, turning neighbors into informants and families into enemies. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how this system of terror was justified, packaged, and sold to the Spanish people as divine will. The machinery of persecution was not born from chaos or mob violence, but from calculated bureaucracy and legal procedure. This is not merely a tale of medieval barbarism, but a case study in how fear can be weaponized, how prejudice can be systematized, and how those who wield absolute power often become prisoners of their own creation. Torquemada's legacy extends far beyond the borders of 15th century Spain, serving as a grim reminder of humanity's capacity for organized cruelty when ideology overrides compassion. The man who would reshape the very concept of religious orthodoxy began his journey in relative obscurity. Born around 1420 in Valladolid, Torquemada entered a world where the boundaries between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities were still fluid, where conversion was often a matter of survival rather than conviction. It was precisely this complexity that would later fuel his obsession with religious purity. What drove a man to dedicate his existence to such systematic brutality? How did someone who took vows of poverty and humility become the most feared name in Spain? The answers lie not in simple sadism, but in the dangerous intersection of personal trauma, political ambition, and religious fanaticism. Torquemada's story reveals how ordinary humans can become instruments of extraordinary evil when the right conditions align. As we delve into this dark chapter of history, we must confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, the fragility of tolerance, and the ease with which societies can slide from diversity into systematic persecution. The echoes of Torquemada's Inquisition can still be heard today, wherever fear is used to justify oppression and where difference is treated as a threat to be eliminated rather than a reality to be embraced. To understand Torquemada's rise, we must first examine the complex religious landscape of 15th century Spain. The Iberian Peninsula had been a remarkable experiment in coexistence for centuries, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities had developed intricate relationships of cooperation and competition. Jews, in particular, had flourished under both Christian and Muslim rule, becoming integral to Spanish commerce, medicine, and administration. However, this delicate balance began to crumble in the late 14th century. The devastating pogroms of 1391 had forced thousands of Jews to convert to Christianity to save their lives and property. These converts, known as conversos, or new Christians, found themselves caught in a nightmarish limbo. To their former Jewish communities, they were traitors who had abandoned their faith. To many old Christians, they remained fundamentally Jewish, their conversions viewed as mere disguises, hiding their true nature. The problem was exacerbated by the very success of many converso families. Within a generation, former Jews had risen to positions of prominence in Spanish society. They became merchants, bankers, physicians, and even clergymen. Some married into noble families, blurring the lines that many old Christians desperately wanted to maintain. This social mobility bred resentment among those who saw conversos as unfair competitors who had gained advantages through deception. Suspicion became the currency of daily life. Did the converso family down the street really observe Christian customs, or were they secretly maintaining Jewish practices? Why did they seem to prosper when honest old Christians struggled? These questions festered in communities across Spain, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that would later prove fertile ground for Torquemada's systematic approach to persecution. The theological implications were equally troubling. If Christianity was the one true faith, how could someone who had genuinely converted continue to be viewed with suspicion? The very existence of conversos challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of religious truth and social identity. Rather than grapple with these complexities, many chose to believe that true conversion was impossible. The Jewish blood carried an indelible stain that no amount of Christian devotion could wash clean. Economic factors further complicated the situation. During times of financial stress, conversos made convenient scapegoats. Their wealth could be confiscated under the pretense of religious punishment, their properties redistributed to loyal old Christians. The Inquisition that Torquemada would later direct became, in part, an instrument of economic redistribution disguised as religious purification. The Crown itself was deeply ambivalent about the converso question. On one hand, converso families provided valuable services and revenue to the royal treasury. Many had become indispensable to the functioning of Spanish commerce and administration. On the other hand, popular anti-converso sentiment was a political force that could not be ignored, especially during times when royal authority needed popular support. Into this volatile mixture of religious anxiety, economic resentment, and social tension stepped young Tomás de Torquemada. Born into a family with its own converso ancestry, his grandmother had been Jewish. He would have understood from childhood the precarious nature of religious identity in Spain. Perhaps it was this personal knowledge of vulnerability that would later drive his merciless pursuit of others who shared his background, as if by eliminating them, he could somehow erase the questionable elements of his own heritage. Tomás de Torquemada's transformation from provincial monk to Grand Inquisitor was neither sudden nor accidental. Born around 1420 in Valladolid, he entered a world where religious identity was becoming increasingly scrutinized and politicized. His family's own complex religious heritage, with Jewish ancestry on his grandmother's side, would have made young Tomás acutely aware of the suspicions that could destroy lives and fortunes in an instant. The Dominican order that Torquemada joined as a young man was already steeped in the intellectual tradition of combating heresy. Founded in the 13th century, partly to counter the Cathar heresy in southern France, the Dominicans had developed sophisticated theological and legal frameworks for identifying and prosecuting religious deviation. They were scholars of suspicion, trained to detect the subtle signs of false belief that might escape less educated observers. Torquemada's early years at the monastery of Santa Cruz in Segovia shaped his worldview in crucial ways. Here, surrounded by ancient texts and learned brothers, he absorbed the Dominican conviction that religious error was not merely mistaken belief, but active corruption that threatened the very fabric of Christian society. The monastery's library contained detailed accounts of previous heretical movements, providing Torquemada with a comprehensive education in the methods and motivations of those who challenged Orthodox Christianity. His rise within the Dominican hierarchy was steady but unremarkable, until a chance encounter changed the trajectory of his life. In 1474, he became confessor to Princess Isabella, the future Queen of Castile. This appointment placed Torquemada at the very heart of Spanish power, giving him unprecedented access to shape the religious and political thinking of one of history's most consequential monarchs. Isabella was young, intelligent, and deeply religious, but she was also politically vulnerable. Her claim to the Castilian throne was disputed, and she needed all the support she could gather. Torquemada understood that her religious devotion could be channeled into political advantage, that demonstrating unwavering commitment to Christian orthodoxy could help legitimize her rule while simultaneously appealing to popular anti-converso sentiment. The relationship between confessor and queen was intimate and influential. During their private sessions, Torquemada painted vivid pictures of the spiritual dangers facing Spain. He spoke of hidden enemies who masqueraded as Christians while secretly practicing the faith of their ancestors. He described a cosmic battle between good and evil playing out on Spanish soil, with Isabella cast as the divinely chosen instrument of purification. Torquemada's theological education had taught him to see religious deviation not as individual failing, but as social contagion. Like a physician diagnosing plague, he viewed converso communities as infected tissue that threatened to corrupt the entire body of Spanish Christianity. This medical metaphor would later become central to Inquisition rhetoric, justifying the most extreme measures as necessary surgery to save the patient. His personal experience of religious suspicion may have driven his particular zealotry. Having lived with the knowledge that his own ancestry could be questioned, Torquemada perhaps felt compelled to demonstrate his Christian authenticity through excessive devotion to the persecution of others. By becoming the most ruthless hunter of crypto-Jews, he could position himself as above suspicion, transforming his vulnerability into unassailable authority. Queen Isabella's transformation from a politically minded monarch to a zealous advocate for religious persecution did not happen overnight. It was the result of careful, methodical manipulation by Torquemada, who understood that the young queen's genuine piety could be weaponized for his own ends. The confessor-queen relationship provided him with unprecedented access to shape not just Isabella's spiritual life, but her understanding of royal duty and divine mission. Torquemada began by exploiting Isabella's legitimate concerns about political stability. Spain in the 1470s was far from unified, with various regional powers challenging royal authority and foreign threats pressing at the borders. Into this context, Torquemada introduced the idea that religious unity was the foundation of political strength. A kingdom divided in faith, he argued, could never achieve the greatness that God intended for Spain. The confessor was masterful at blending personal spiritual guidance with political counsel. During their private sessions, he would speak of Isabella's soul while simultaneously discussing affairs of state. He painted her rule not as a political accident, but as divine providence, suggesting that God had elevated her to the throne specifically to purify Spain of religious contamination. This narrative transformed every policy decision into a sacred duty. Torquemada's rhetoric was carefully calibrated to appeal to Isabella's particular psychological makeup. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and deeply committed to proving herself worthy of a crown that many believed should have gone to a male heir. The idea that she had been chosen by God for a special mission of religious purification provided both validation of her authority and a unique role that no male predecessor had fulfilled. The confessor also exploited Isabella's maternal instincts, speaking frequently of the children of Spain who were being led astray by false Christians. He described converso families as a kind of spiritual poison, corrupting innocent souls through their example and influence. The Queen's duty was not just to protect Spain's political integrity, but to safeguard the eternal souls of her subjects. Perhaps most cunningly, Torquemada presented the establishment of a Spanish Inquisition, not as an innovation, but as a restoration. He spoke of earlier periods when Spain had been more purely Christian, when religious authority had been respected and heresy had been properly controlled. The proposed Inquisition was thus framed not as a radical new institution, but as a return to traditional values that had been neglected. The psychological pressure on Isabella was immense. Every decision became a test of her faith, every hesitation a sign of spiritual weakness. Torquemada created an environment where questioning his counsel was tantamount to questioning God's will. The young queen, already burdened with the responsibilities of rule, found herself carrying the additional weight of cosmic responsibility for Spain's spiritual destiny. When Isabella finally agreed to petition Pope Sixtus IV for permission to establish the Spanish Inquisition, she believed she was fulfilling God's will rather than authorizing one of history's most systematic campaigns of persecution. Torquemada had successfully convinced her that mercy toward suspected heretics was actually cruelty toward the innocent Christians they were corrupting. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition required papal approval, and securing this authorization proved to be a delicate diplomatic dance that revealed Torquemada's political sophistication. Pope Sixtus IV was initially reluctant to grant Spain such broad powers of religious persecution, partly because existing church law already provided mechanisms for dealing with heresy, and partly because he suspected that the Spanish crown's motives were more political and economic than purely religious. Torquemada understood that the papal court required careful handling. Rome had its own complex relationships with converso communities, many of whom had fled to Italy during previous persecutions and had become valuable members of various Italian societies. Additionally, the Pope was wary of granting any secular authority too much control over religious matters, fearing that such powers might eventually be turned against papal interests. The campaign for papal authorization began with a carefully orchestrated propaganda effort. Spanish ambassadors to Rome carried detailed reports of alleged converso conspiracies, describing a systematic campaign of religious subversion that threatened not just Spanish Christianity, but the broader Catholic world. These reports painted a picture of crypto-Jews working in coordination to undermine Christian faith from within, using their positions of trust to corrupt the innocent and spread heretical ideas. Torquemada's genius lay in framing the request not as Spanish aggression, but as Spanish vulnerability. The proposed Inquisition was presented as a defensive measure, a necessary response to an organized assault on Christianity. Spain was portrayed as the front line of a cosmic battle between good and evil, with the Catholic Church's very survival potentially hanging in the balance. The economic arguments were more subtle, but equally important. Spanish representatives hinted that converso wealth was being used to fund anti-Christian activities, that trade networks dominated by new Christians were being exploited to spread heretical ideas across Europe. The Inquisition would serve not just Spanish interests, but broader Christian commercial networks by ensuring that only genuinely faithful Christians controlled important economic relationships. Personal diplomacy also played a crucial role. Spanish nobles with connections to the papal court were mobilized to support the cause, sharing carefully crafted stories of converso duplicity and Christian suffering. These personal testimonies carried weight that official documents could not match, creating an atmosphere of crisis that demanded immediate action. The breakthrough came when Spanish negotiators offered to share Inquisition revenues with Rome. While this was not the primary motivation for papal approval, it helped overcome lingering bureaucratic resistance. The Pope could present his authorization as serving both spiritual and practical church interests, providing funds that could be used for legitimate religious purposes while addressing what appeared to be a genuine threat to Christian faith. When Pope Sixtus IV finally issued the bull Exigit Sincerae Devotionis on November 1, 1478, authorizing the Spanish Inquisition, he believed he was granting limited powers to address a specific regional problem. He could not have imagined that he was enabling the creation of an institution that would operate for over 3 centuries and would fundamentally reshape the relationship between religious and secular authority throughout the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Inquisition under Torquemada's direction was remarkable not for its random brutality, but for its systematic organization. This was terror administered through carefully structured bureaucracy, with detailed procedures, standardized forms, and established hierarchies that transformed persecution into administrative routine. Torquemada understood that sustained oppression required institutional stability, that fear could be more effectively maintained through predictable processes than through chaotic violence. The Inquisition's geographic structure reflected Torquemada's vision of comprehensive control. Spain was divided into tribunals, each responsible for a specific region and answerable directly to the Supreme Council in Madrid. Local inquisitors were appointed based on their theological education and demonstrated loyalty, creating a network of educated persecution that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining doctrinal consistency. The procedural manual that Torquemada developed became the foundation for Inquisition operations across the Spanish Empire. These instructions detailed everything from the proper methods for conducting investigations to the precise wording of sentences, ensuring that persecution would be carried out with legal precision. Every torture session was documented, every confession recorded, every execution logged in official records that still survive today. Perhaps most chillingly, the Inquisition developed sophisticated methods for detecting crypto-Judaism that turned everyday behaviors into evidence of heresy. Families who lit candles on Friday evenings, who prepared food in certain ways, or who showed reluctance to eat pork could find themselves under investigation. The system created an atmosphere where the most innocent actions carried potentially fatal implications. The economic structure of the Inquisition was equally systematic. Confiscated property was carefully catalogued and distributed according to established formulas, with portions going to the crown, the church, and the inquisitors themselves. This created powerful financial incentives for persecution, ensuring that the system would be self-sustaining and that those who operated it would have personal stakes in its continuation. The recruitment of informants was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Torquemada's system. The Inquisition offered rewards for information about suspected heretics while protecting the anonymity of accusers. This created a network of surveillance that penetrated every level of Spanish society, making private conversations dangerous and turning friends into potential enemies. Medical professionals were co-opted into the persecution apparatus, required to monitor patients for signs of Jewish customs and to report suspicious behaviors to inquisitorial authorities. Physicians who had once been bound by confidentiality now found themselves serving as instruments of surveillance, their medical knowledge transformed into tools for detecting religious deviation. The legal procedures developed by the Inquisition inverted traditional concepts of justice. Accused individuals were not informed of the specific charges against them or the identity of their accusers. They were required to confess their sins without knowing what crimes they were alleged to have committed, creating a psychological maze that few could navigate successfully. One of Torquemada's most psychologically devastating innovations was the Edict of Grace, a proclamation that offered temporary amnesty to those who voluntarily confessed their heretical practices and denounced others who shared their guilt. This policy transformed communities into networks of mutual suspicion and betrayal, destroying social bonds that had taken generations to build, while providing the Inquisition with vast amounts of intelligence about suspected heretics. The edict was read publicly in churches across Spain, announced with great ceremony, and accompanied by sermons that emphasized both the mercy being offered and the terrible consequences awaiting those who failed to take advantage of this opportunity. The language was carefully crafted to create maximum psychological pressure, suggesting that the Inquisition already knew about widespread heretical practices and was generously offering one final chance for repentance. The time limit imposed by the edict, typically 30 to 40 days, created a sense of desperate urgency. Families were forced to make agonizing decisions about whether to confess to practices they might not even consider heretical, whether to implicate relatives and friends, and whether to trust in the Inquisition's promises of mercy. The clock was always ticking, and delay itself became evidence of guilt. Those who came forward during the grace period found themselves trapped in a web of requirements that extended far beyond simple confession. They were required to provide detailed information about their own heretical practices, but also to name others who had participated in or witnessed these activities. The Inquisition made clear that incomplete cooperation would void any protection offered by the edict. The psychological pressure was enormous. Many conversos who had lived as Christians for decades were forced to remember and confess childhood experiences in Jewish households, practices they had long abandoned or forgotten. Others found themselves inventing sins they had never committed, believing that failure to confess would mark them as obstinate heretics deserving of death. Community dynamics became nightmarish as the grace period progressed. Neighbors watched each other for signs of preparation to confess, wondering who might be planning to denounce them. Family meals became exercises in suspicion, as relatives considered whether seemingly innocent conversations might later be reported to inquisitorial authorities. The Inquisition's promise of reconciliation proved largely illusory. Those who confessed under the Edict of Grace avoided execution but faced other severe penalties, including public humiliation, substantial financial penalties, and permanent restrictions on their social and economic activities. They were required to wear distinctive clothing marking them as former heretics, ensuring that their shame would be visible to all. Perhaps most cruelly, those who participated in the Edict of Grace found that their cooperation did not guarantee safety for their families. Information provided during the grace period was used to build cases against relatives who had not confessed, creating situations where parents' attempts to save themselves resulted in the persecution of their children. In 1490, Torquemada orchestrated one of history's most notorious blood libel cases, the alleged ritual murder of the Holy Child of La Guardia. This fabricated crime became the justification for the mass expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, demonstrating how manufactured evidence could be used to justify the persecution of entire populations. The case reveals Torquemada's understanding of how symbolic narratives could mobilize popular support for policies that might otherwise seem extreme. The story began when a converso named Benito Garcia was arrested on charges unrelated to ritual murder. Under torture, he was induced to confess to participating in the kidnapping and crucifixion of a Christian child, allegedly part of a Jewish conspiracy to destroy Christianity through magical rituals. The confession implicated both conversos and practicing Jews in a plot that combined the worst medieval stereotypes about Jewish religious practices. What made the case particularly useful for Torquemada's purposes was that no missing child was ever identified, no body was ever found, and no family ever came forward to report a disappearance. The entire case rested on confessions extracted through torture and a narrative that conveniently confirmed popular prejudices about Jewish malevolence. The absence of physical evidence was explained as proof of the conspirators' sophistication in hiding their crimes. The trial proceedings were carefully staged to maximize public impact. Testimonies were read in public squares, generating outrage and fear among Christian populations who now believed they faced an organized Jewish threat to their children's safety. The case was presented not as an isolated incident, but as evidence of a broader pattern of Jewish hostility toward Christianity. Torquemada ensured that the trial received widespread publicity throughout Spain, with official reports circulated to nobility and clergy across the kingdom. The narrative of Jewish ritual murder provided a powerful emotional justification for extreme measures, transforming policy debates about religious minorities into questions about protecting innocent children from demonic predators. The convicted men were burned at the stake in November 1491, but their executions were only the beginning of the story's impact. The case became a cornerstone of anti-Jewish propaganda, cited repeatedly in official documents and popular literature as evidence that Jews posed an existential threat to Christian Spain. The martyred child became a folk saint, his alleged suffering offered as proof that coexistence with Jews was impossible. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Jewish communities across Spain understood that the ritual murder accusation could be deployed against any of them at any time, that their very presence in Christian society was now framed as a threat to innocent life. The case created an atmosphere of terror that made ordinary social interactions dangerous for Jews and conversos alike. The fabricated nature of the Holy Child case was evident to many contemporary observers, but the political utility of the narrative made truth irrelevant. Torquemada had created a powerful propaganda tool that could be used to justify any level of persecution. A story so emotionally charged that questioning its veracity became evidence of sympathy for child murderers. The Edict of Expulsion, issued on March 31st, 1492, represented the culmination of Torquemada's campaign to transform Spain into a religiously homogeneous society. The document gave Spanish Jews 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave the country forever, abandoning property and possessions that had often been accumulated over generations. This mass deportation was presented not as ethnic cleansing, but as spiritual necessity, the final step in purifying Spain of corrupting influences. The timing of the expulsion was carefully calculated to maximize its impact. The reconquest of Granada in January 1492 had completed the Christian reconquest of Iberian Peninsula, creating a moment of national triumph that could be channeled into religious extremism. Torquemada presented the expulsion as the natural completion of the reconquest, the final elimination of non-Christian elements that had allegedly corrupted Spanish society for centuries. The practical implementation of the expulsion revealed the systematic cruelty that characterized Torquemada's approach to religious policy. Jews were forbidden to take gold, silver, or precious stones with them, forcing them to liquidate generations of accumulated wealth at devastating losses. Many were forced to trade valuable properties for pack animals or passage on overcrowded ships, creating a massive transfer of wealth from Jewish to Christian hands. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that between 100,000 and 200,000 Jews were forced to leave Spain, many dying during the journey or in the refugee camps that emerged in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Families were separated as some members chose conversion, while others chose exile, creating divisions that would persist for generations. The expulsion also had devastating consequences for Spanish society itself. Many of the expelled Jews had been craftsmen, merchants, physicians, and scholars whose skills and knowledge were not easily replaced. The Spanish economy suffered immediate disruption, as trade networks collapsed and professional services disappeared overnight. Some historians argue that Spain never fully recovered from the intellectual and economic losses caused by the expulsion. Torquemada's justification for the expulsion revealed his understanding of how religious rhetoric could mask ethnic and economic motivations. Official documents spoke of protecting New Christians from the corrupting influence of their former co-religionists, presenting the expulsion as a mercy that would allow conversos to fully embrace Christianity without the temptation of Jewish example. The international response to the expulsion was mixed, with some Christian kingdoms refusing to accept Jewish refugees, while others welcomed them as valuable additions to their populations. The Ottoman Empire, in particular, benefited enormously from Spanish Jewish expertise in commerce, medicine, and administration, gaining skills that Spain had discarded in the name of religious purity. The expulsion order also contained provisions that revealed Torquemada's obsession with preventing any future Jewish return to Spain. Jews who left were forbidden from ever returning, even for brief visits, and Christians who aided Jewish refugees faced severe penalties. These measures were designed to ensure that the purification of Spain would be permanent and irreversible. The physical spaces created and occupied by the Spanish Inquisition under Torquemada's direction were carefully designed to embody and amplify the terror that the institutions sought to inspire. From the imposing tribunal buildings to the intimate torture chambers, every architectural choice served to reinforce the Inquisition's power and the helplessness of those who fell under its scrutiny. These spaces were theaters of persecution, stages where the drama of confession and punishment played out before carefully selected audiences. Torquemada's most significant architectural legacy was the Palace of the Inquisition in Seville, a fortress-like structure that dominated the city's skyline and served as a constant reminder of inquisitorial power. The building's severe facade offered no comfort or hope to those who entered, its massive walls and small windows creating an atmosphere of claustrophobic dread. Inside, the chambers were arranged to create maximum psychological pressure, with accused heretics forced to wait in cramped cells, while the sounds of interrogation echoed through the corridors. The torture chambers themselves were marvels of calculated intimidation. The walls were lined with carefully maintained instruments of pain, each designed for specific purposes and displayed with museum-like precision. The rooms were kept scrupulously clean, as if the suffering they contained was a sacred ritual requiring proper reverence. Medical equipment was positioned alongside torture devices, creating surreal scenes where healing and harming were merged into a single administrative process. Perhaps most disturbing was Torquemada's choice to establish his personal residence and chapel on the site of a former Jewish cemetery in Avila. This decision was both practically and symbolically significant, representing the literal burial of Jewish Spain beneath the foundations of Christian authority. The chapel, where Torquemada conducted daily prayers, was built directly over Jewish graves, creating a macabre monument to the transformation of Spanish religious landscape. The public spaces created for auto da fe ceremonies were equally calculated to inspire fear and demonstrate power. These elaborate spectacles were held in major city squares, with wooden platforms constructed to ensure that every citizen could witness the fate of those who challenged religious orthodoxy. The condemned were dressed in distinctive yellow garments, painted with flames and demons. Their humiliation made visible to crowds that were required to attend and applaud the proceedings. The processional routes leading to execution sites were carefully planned to maximize public exposure and symbolic meaning. Condemned heretics were forced to walk through the very neighborhoods where they had lived and worked, past houses where they had been guests, through markets where they had conducted business. These final journeys transformed familiar urban landscapes into stages for public shaming and social death. Torquemada also paid careful attention to the spaces where confessions were recorded and sentences pronounced. These chambers were designed to overwhelm accused individuals with symbols of authority and learning, religious artwork, legal texts, scholarly furniture that emphasized the intellectual and spiritual superiority of their persecutors. The psychological message was clear. Resistance was not only futile, but intellectually and morally indefensible. The documentation centers where Inquisition records were maintained represented another form of architectural intimidation. These vast libraries contained detailed files on thousands of individuals, creating a bureaucratic panopticon where past actions and associations could be retrieved and examined at any time. The very existence of these archives ensured that no one could ever feel entirely safe from scrutiny, that any moment of questioning could trigger an investigation reaching back decades. By the 1490s, Torquemada had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in transforming Spanish society. The Inquisition operated with machine-like efficiency. Jewish communities had been expelled or destroyed, and religious conformity had been enforced with unprecedented thoroughness. Yet in these final years, the Grand Inquisitor began to experience the psychological torment that would characterize his remaining days, as if the weight of his accumulated cruelties had finally begun to crush even his iron will. Torquemada's last years were marked by increasing paranoia and isolation. The man who had taught Spain to fear hidden enemies now lived in constant terror of assassination, surrounding himself with guards and rarely appearing in public without elaborate security precautions. He had created a society where suspicion was the norm, and now he found himself trapped within the same atmosphere of fear that he had imposed on others. The irony of his situation became particularly acute when rumors began to circulate about his own Jewish ancestry. Despite his decades of service to Christian orthodoxy, despite his responsibility for the deaths of thousands of conversos, Torquemada found himself subject to the same whispered accusations that had destroyed so many others. The system he had created was so perfect in its paranoia that not even its architect could escape suspicion entirely. His physical decline was as dramatic as his psychological deterioration. Contemporary accounts describe a man who had become gaunt and hollow-eyed, who spent increasing hours in prayer but seemed to find no comfort in his devotions. The confident prosecutor, who had once accused heretics to gibbering confessions, now appeared to be questioning his own soul with the same merciless intensity he had once directed at others. The chapel built over the Jewish cemetery in Avila became Torquemada's obsession in his final years. He spent hours praying in the space where Jewish bones lay beneath Christian altar stones, perhaps unconsciously seeking forgiveness from the very people he had spent his life persecuting. The building that had once symbolized his triumph over Jewish Spain had become a monument to his own spiritual emptiness. Reports from his final months describe a man haunted by visions and nightmares, who would wake screaming about burning figures and accusing voices. The confessor who had once provided spiritual comfort to Queen Isabella now appeared to be beyond the reach of any earthly consolation. He had created hell on earth for thousands of others, and now seemed to be experiencing his own private inferno. Even in his final illness, Torquemada showed no signs of repentance or regret. When priests visited his deathbed, he spoke not of mercy or forgiveness, but of concerns that his work had been incomplete, that he had not been thorough enough in eliminating heretical influences from Spanish soil. The man who had demanded absolute confessions from others would make no acknowledgement of his own sins. His death on September 16, 1498, was as lonely as his final years had been. Despite his immense power and influence, few mourned his passing. The institution he had created would continue for centuries, but its founder died isolated and tormented, a victim of the same forces of suspicion and fear that he had unleashed upon his countrymen. The Spanish Inquisition that Torquemada created outlived its founder by more than 3 centuries, operating until 1834 and leaving an indelible mark on Spanish culture, politics, and society. His innovations in systematic persecution became models for oppressive regimes throughout history, while the social divisions he created continued to influence Spanish life long after the last auto da fe had been held. The institution that began as a response to a specific religious crisis evolved into a comprehensive system of social control that shaped Spanish identity in ways that persist to this day. The immediate consequences of Torquemada's work were devastating for Spanish intellectual and economic development. The expulsion of Jewish communities and the persecution of conversos eliminated many of Spain's most skilled artisans, merchants, and scholars, creating gaps in Spanish society that were never adequately filled. The climate of fear that the Inquisition created discouraged innovation and free thinking, contributing to Spain's gradual decline from European intellectual leadership. The international impact of the Spanish Inquisition extended far beyond Spain's borders. As Spanish power expanded across the Americas and into other parts of Europe, inquisitorial methods and attitudes were exported to colonial territories, creating systems of oppression that affected indigenous populations, African slaves, and European settlers alike. The bureaucratic techniques that Torquemada developed for detecting and prosecuting heresy became templates for persecution in contexts far removed from their original religious justifications. The cultural trauma inflicted by the Inquisition shaped Spanish mentalities in profound and lasting ways. The institution's emphasis on religious conformity and its suspicion of intellectual innovation contributed to a culture of intellectual caution that persisted long after the Inquisition itself had been abolished. The fear of being accused of heterodox thinking created an atmosphere where creative expression and scientific inquiry were viewed with suspicion. The archival legacy of the Inquisition provides historians with an unprecedented window into the mechanisms of systematic oppression. The detailed records that Torquemada insisted be kept for every case created one of history's most complete documentation of institutional persecution. These records reveal not only the scope of inquisitorial activity, but also the bureaucratic mindset that made such systematic cruelty possible. Modern scholarship has revealed the extent to which economic motivations drove much of the Inquisition's activity. The confiscation of property from accused heretics provided substantial revenues for the Crown and the Church, creating financial incentives for persecution that had little to do with genuine religious concerns. Torquemada's system had effectively monetized prejudice, turning social suspicion into economic opportunity. The psychological techniques developed by inquisitors became part of a broader European understanding of how to break down individual resistance through isolation, uncertainty, and fear. These methods would later be studied and adapted by modern totalitarian regimes, making the Spanish Inquisition a predecessor to many of the most horrific episodes of 20th century persecution. The rehabilitation of Torquemada's reputation in some Spanish nationalist circles during the 19th and 20th centuries demonstrates how historical memory can be manipulated to serve contemporary political purposes. The man who had created one of history's most systematic campaigns of persecution was sometimes recast as a defender of Spanish unity and Catholic orthodoxy, showing how even the most obviously destructive historical figures can be transformed into symbols of national virtue when circumstances demand it. The story of Tomás de Torquemada forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of civilized society. Here was not a monster from the margins of society, but a respected religious leader who transformed institutional power into an instrument of systematic persecution. His life demonstrates how easily ordinary prejudices can be weaponized, how quickly legal systems can be corrupted to serve oppressive ends, and how the rhetoric of virtue can be used to justify the most appalling cruelties. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that Torquemada's success depended not on his individual sadism, but on the complicity of thousands of ordinary Spaniards who participated in or benefited from the system he created. The Inquisition required informants to provide accusations, officials to process cases, crowds to witness executions, and citizens to accept confiscated property. The machinery of persecution operated only because an entire society was willing to collaborate in the destruction of their neighbors. The irony of Torquemada's life, a man of Jewish ancestry who dedicated himself to destroying Jewish communities, illustrates the tragic psychology of internalized oppression. His campaign against conversos can be understood as a form of self-hatred projected onto others, an attempt to purge himself of qualities that he had been taught to despise. This personal dimension makes his story not just a tale of historical persecution, but a case study in how societies teach their members to hate themselves. The bureaucratic efficiency of the Spanish Inquisition offers sobering lessons for modern societies grappling with their own forms of systematic discrimination. Torquemada's innovation lay not in the invention of new cruelties, but in the systematization of existing prejudices, the transformation of social suspicion into administrative procedure. His legacy reminds us that some of history's greatest evils have emerged not from chaos, but from organization, not from passion, but from policy. The enduring relevance of Torquemada's story lies in its demonstration of how quickly societies can slide from tolerance to persecution when fear is allowed to override reason and compassion. The techniques he developed for identifying hidden enemies and justifying their elimination have been employed by oppressive regimes throughout history, making his work a template for persecution that transcends its original religious context. Yet there is also hope to be found in the ultimate failure of Torquemada's vision. Despite centuries of persecution, Spanish Jewish culture survived in exile, maintaining traditions and identities that proved more durable than the political systems that sought to destroy them. The communities that Torquemada scattered across the Mediterranean world often flourished in their new homes, contributing to the societies that welcomed them while preserving the heritage that Spain had rejected. The judgment of history has been clear and unanimous in its condemnation of Torquemada's legacy. No serious scholar or religious leader today defends the methods of the Spanish Inquisition, and the institution that once commanded fear and respect is now remembered only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and political persecution. In the end, Tomás de Torquemada's life serves as a mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for both evil and redemption. His story reminds us that the impulse to persecution lies dormant in every society, waiting for the right conditions to emerge, but also that such impulses can be recognized, resisted, and ultimately defeated by those who choose conscience over conformity, compassion over cruelty, and justice over fear.